Welcome to the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council 4th Annual Meeting, CCLC2020, Open for Innovation. We have an ambitious program today that will touch upon energy policy, innovation policy, tax incentives, trade barriers, and opening markets to new innovative technology and competition.
All the policies that had come before then were now subtly off base and out of date. When you have new unsubsidized profits, suddenly the tax rates on those profits matter a great deal. That there's, in fact, a way to take into account negative externalities that doesn't necessarily involve imposing burdens on the economy or demonizing any one industry, that you can use positive feedback rewards rather than negative feedback loops. So today, what we want to do is look at ways that we can open markets faster.
The technological innovations of the 80s and 90s really unleashed the potential for competition in generation and the creation of wholesale power markets.
It's customer driven and it's all about economic development. How do you make a good location and a good place for people to live and have jobs?
My takeaway from that is that we will have more success moving markets to competition.
Now there's essentially no premium anymore, right? It's the same price. You can get 100% renewable for the same price as almost anything else. Not just for competition, but for the environmental benefits that have come along with it.
One of our central hypotheses in the clean free market policy is that it really makes a difference to let clean technologies compete, and we think that it will translate into competitive markets decarbonizing faster and cheaper and more stably than uncompetitive markets.
Technological innovation is not rewarded in the regulated market.
Right.
You're beaten down with monopsony power. Regulatory power corrupts over time, and I don't think that is very conducive to a technologically innovative environment.
There was massive dissatisfaction in the population with the energy service. We've been dealing for years with blackouts in certain periods of the year and expensive power as well.
There was this incentive that they needed financing, and an international agreement helped to push the country into opening up markets for competition. We're going to be looking at clean tax cuts as an incentive for competition. So he was talking about tax-exempt debt, tax-exempt bonds, tax-exempt loans, and how these would accelerate clean infrastructure deployment.
And so at the same time, after-tax rates of return for investors are still high, but the cost of borrowing and the imputed cost of using those energy assets is low to the users. And that one change alone would have massive impacts.
What we call these is clean asset bonds and loans. They basically are tax-exempt debt that finances a range of clean infrastructure. So you're giving up the tax expense where the revenues are low and taking in tax revenues where the revenues are high.
So we've come up with, I think, a tightly defined package and developed legislative language. We're now trying to get this introduced. The challenges have been thus far, Congress basically has not authorized tax-exempt financing for private entities. So that's something else. We are thinking about how can we tighten eligibility.
So I think once there is a market that doesn't require a PhD in the complexity of how to use those tools, you could start to see an open marketplace. You could imagine getting access to this sort of tax-exempt municipal debt market would be a game changer for them. I think part of this is really just opening up the scope around where people feel comfortable financing sustainability solutions that are outside of solar and wind. I would say there's probably $70 to $75 billion of the projects that we've seen that would be unlocked by, a policy like this.
I think, there's going to be a huge policy opportunity here in the next 2 to 5 years of how do we get out of this kind of significant economic downturn that I think is unprecedented.
I think what we're trying to do here today is think about ways to bridge the policy gap between innovation and selling it around the world.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the panel about patent boxes. As a patent box is where you, in a country, you develop the investment research and development to create a patent of some sort of new technology, and the revenues deriving from that patent are taxed at a much lower rate. If we did it for a green technology, we say if you develop a patent at a green technology, you're taxed at a much lower rate. It could be a neat way of doing it to really incent a whole lot of innovation in the green space.
Sam Thirdstrom has been working with Representative McKinley and Schrader's office, but they've been working on an idea to have a bunch of incentives, R&D investment and tax incentives for innovation investments that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really encourage innovation.
One policy, could be a federal policy that simply says no subsidies for monopolies. Another idea is a little bit more friendly to the monopoly, which is demonopolization tax cuts.
In other words, digital technologies reduce transaction costs, and it makes it easier and more valuable to coordinate our actions through markets than through regulation.
I mean, the United States today, more than half the states still exist in a paradigm where consumers have no choice in where they get their electricity or natural gas supply. Instead, they're served by monopolies. And that creates all sorts of perverse incentives. I really think more focus needs to be on that demonopolization. Just doing things like that, I think, are well worth the attention because ultimately this is going to have to be about those end use consumers and creating value for them. What we're really seeing there is, for the first time in the history of electricity markets, a very active demand side of the market. And we just know that if supply is going to become more intermittent over the course of time, you're going to need more flexibility on the demand side, and really only a highly competitive retail market, as opposed to a retail market that's dominated by a monopoly, is going to be capable of making that engine work.
I love Travis. I feel like my head has expanded 3 sizes.
First of all, as we get away from large central station coal, and we're not building new large central station nuclear, everything else can be fully distributed, and it can all be behind the meter. The emergence of IoT and machine learning is going to bring forward the tools in the next 10 years. It will bring transparency to the grid that is currently in the hands of the shamans.
Thanks, Jim. I'm all in favor of digitization, reducing transaction costs all the way up and down the stack and around the distribution edge.
I think one of the big things that we see in West Virginia is that, while we've always been a coal producing state, and we are very proud of that, in fact, we're proud that we were powering the nation for so long. I don't know of anybody who is really in favor of a monopoly, right? So some sort of a tax incentive to demonopolize, I think, is an incredible idea. We were trying to make West Virginia one of the best places in the nation to hold intellectual property and patents. And so I absolutely love the idea of sort of a patent box that would make West Virginia an interesting place to hold that intellectual property.
The person who came up with the green patent box suggestion is Hendrik Brakel, the chief economic advisor to the Canadian opposition. Wouldn't it be great if we can do a trans-border, Canada-US green patent box and maybe spread it to other countries of the world, so that you get a green stimulus and intellectual property protection at the same time?
This is the power of LAMP. We connect our policymakers with experts like all of you.
Quite frankly, the incentives of getting in the market are usually there if the market's open, but there are so many little obstacles.
There is one major catalyst available that has not been tried yet, and that's to bring the lawsuit under the U.S. Constitution declaring the electricity grid unconstitutional in its current makeup, which is available to us now because the grid is now interconnected. No different than the breakup of AT&T, no different than deregulation of airlines, no different than the deregulation of trains, no different than the deregulation of milk.
Jim, I love it. And I got to say that the original version of that strategy was pioneered by none other than Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the first tycoons in this country, when he broke open the New York ferry boat market.
Positive incentives or negative incentives. And we want to encourage an activity, like we want to encourage innovations in green technology, you want a positive incentive. Well, one way to get a positive incentive is to reduce the negative incentive that are taxes. With respect to the co-victory bonds and loans, this is really taking the concept and trying to get proof of that concept with respect to our current economic downturn. We need to help employees and businesses bridge this shutdown of the economy that the virus has created. And so taxes are inevitably a negative incentive against all of that, depending on how it was issued. Reduce either the corporate income tax with respect to the bank that they're issuing it, or the capital gains or the income tax on the bonds that were issued to the capital markets. That is about a 30% reduction in your interest costs. We can actually help the economy recover at the same time that we can incent innovation in the green technology space.
If we issue these co-victory bonds and loans, 5-year terms, we have a 2-year period in which they can be issued while the economy is recovering from this recession. If we issued $1 trillion of this debt, it would cost $30 to $40 billion.
As Rod indicated, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was a key driver for reducing, especially tariffs in trade between nations, to the point where now the main barriers to trade are not really tariffs. Yes, they in some cases are still a problem, but the main barriers now are what Shankar Singham has called anti-competitive market distortions.
If your goal is to have a more competitive market and a larger market for any product, but particularly for these kinds of products, tackling anti-competitive market distortions is going to be a key aspect of trade agreements going forward. And the other aspect of it is obviously free trade, and is obviously the idea of lowering tariff barriers on products that are environmental goods. And that's an agenda that is a lot easier to push forward. The ultimate goal is to have a pro-competitive market that is of sufficient size that it can deliver better prices, more choice, all of these things that competitive markets do around the world.
And I'll start actually with Ronald Steenblack, who is at ISD, if Ronald's on the call, who is an expert in environment and trade, and has been deeply involved in the ACCTS, which is an agreement among a number of nations to seek to reduce barriers to trade in environmental goods and services and reduce, for example, subsidies to fossil fuels.
It started out with a proposal last September involving Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, New Zealand, and Norway, and in January or February, Switzerland joined it. So they have 4 areas that they're negotiating: eliminating tariffs on environmental goods, making binding commitments on trade and environmental services, creating new disciplines to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then a little bit more wonky one, develop guidelines for voluntary eco-labeling programs and associated mechanisms.
Now, what I think is extremely interesting to note is part of the change in mentality and in outlook that has occurred as a result of full-scale trade and investment integration between 2 countries that over 25 years ago, it was thought this was impossible. Mexico, the United States, and Canada were the 3 countries in the context of the North American Free Trade Agreement. As a result of this paradigm shift in economics driven by free trade and driven by a free trade agreement negotiated by the 3 parts, the number 1 driver of competitiveness today is seen as affordable and reliable energy. Instead of focusing on a wall between the United States and Mexico, why not focus on an investment-driven region that is conformed of solar and wind farms throughout the entire border, and that is completely private investment-driven? Not 1 cent, not even the need for any specific tax policy to spur this type of investment. I've written a great deal about it, but I think it's this type of out-of-the-box thinking that can go a long way to give credibility and to give substance to clean capitalism.
Roberto, thank you very much. We're really honored to have Atlas Network here, and I'm very pleased to have such genuine free market thinkers at the table who have been missing in previous climate and environmental discussions too often.
Thanks, Rod. I appreciate the attention here and the numerous participants from around the US, and I know that we have some global attendance here too. So thank you for that. I think that the key message that is coming across in what I've been listening to, a lot of folks interested in expanding market competition, expanding trade, and really tackling in a meaningful way the clean energy transition and climate crisis that we know we need to get busy and handle. For that reason, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, my organization, has been the champion of an idea that would help provide, in a limited government way, help provide more visibility and reduce barriers for folks to engage in carbon markets and specifically in offsets. So CRES has worked with a handful of senators and representatives in what we've seen introduced as a bipartisan, bicameral climate bill. So I should repeat that, bipartisan, both houses of Congress, climate bill called the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which focuses on empowering farmers, land managers, in terms of foresters and ranchers to be able to develop carbon offset credits on their land and sell them on a voluntary basis to corporations or individuals who want to reduce their emissions and lessen their carbon footprint. We know the math works. You see that there is surging demand for zero emissions or low emissions sources and options like offsets. Every day, there are other states and municipalities, religious institutions, universities, you name it. And what we want to be able to do is assure that America's farmers and ranchers can participate in this market. Right now, they're responsible for about 10% of US emissions. But if we provide a mechanism where they can get paid to reduce their emissions, they can diversify their income. It will help the family farm. CRES works on called a voluntary framework that would help do the same thing for other sectors, but basically provide more information and accountability and transparency into these voluntary commitments and really allow the power of markets to help guide emissions downward.
One of the things that I find really intriguing about your effort is that this is not a mandated carbon market. This is a voluntary carbon market. It's not imposing a tax on people, a hidden tax. So it makes all the sense in the world. And further than that, I think you're going to open up cross-border policy opportunities. For instance, what if Canada joined in the Growing Climate Solutions Act and you were able to trade offsets? What if you were able to use these voluntary offsets, as a carrot for international free trade and competition?
Maybe, Bruce, you could give us a few insights from your perspective on what's happening in Canada.
We've just undertaken a detailed assessment of the opportunities for decarbonization of the power system in northeastern North America. And this is an area that's quite extensive, including all of New England, New York, Ontario, Quebec, and the eastern Canadian provinces. What came out of that work is the recognition that we really need to do two things in combination. We need to increase the investment in the grid interties and the transmission interconnections throughout the region. And then we really need to look at how we can shift the market rules to allow for, greater competition and access. We've got a utility like Hydro-Quebec that has massive hydroelectric resources, significant supply of carbon-free electricity. But often it can't get to markets like New York City because it gets blocked by, states like Maine and Vermont that don't want power lines running through their states. So what we're proposing is a regional planning process that starts getting people in a room together to understand the broader benefits in terms of decarbonizing, greater benefits to consumers, greater reliability. But that's only going to work if we have a greater flow and access and competition for the electric resources in the region. I'll leave it there, Rod. I just wanted to give that quick snapshot.
We appreciate everyone being here, offering their insights. It's been terrific. We want to work with you. These are complex issues and we need all of your help. Thank you very much.